Good evening. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're so pleased you have joined us for today's program presented by IAALA, or IAALA, the International Association of Armenian Librarians and Archivists, under the umbrella of the Society for Armenian Studies. IAALA was created to provide a worldwide platform for archivists and librarians working with Armenian collections to network with each other, share information and ideas and solve challenges, promote issues important to our field, encourage participation and provide mentorship, and to uncover, surface, and map hidden collections, both physical and digital. Please go to our website, iaala.org, to find out more about us and to view past programs or follow us on social media. Also consider joining this all-volunteer effort. Here to introduce our presenter for IAALA's In Focus number 5 presentation with Dr. Nora Lessersohn is our moderator, Dr. Khachik Muradyan, who's a member of the executive board of IAALA. Dr. Muradyan is a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University and is the Armenian and Georgian area specialist at the Library of Congress. Take it away, Khachik.
Thank you and welcome, everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. It's good to be here. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be introducing Nora. Dr. Nora Lessersohn is a historian of U.S., Ottoman, and Armenian history with a focus on the lives of Armenian Americans. She earned her PhD in history from University College London in 2023, supported by a Carlos Gulbenkian Armenian Studies Scholarship. In 2021-2022, she was a predoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the National Museum of American History. She earned her BA in the study of religion at Harvard College and her MA in Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University, where she currently is a visiting fellow. Dr. Lessersohn has published articles on the memoir of her great-grandfather, Hovannes Cherishyan, and is now preparing a manuscript on the life and work of Christopher Oscanyan, who you will hear about today. The talk is going to be about 30 minutes, after which we will have an opportunity to ask Nora questions. I will stop now, and Nora, you take it away.
Great, thank you, Khachik, and thank you to everyone on the committee for the invitation. And I know some of you in the audience, these kind supporters in the audience, have heard me talk before, but I promise there will definitely be new things for everyone today. So as usual, I'm going to be talking about Christopher Oscanyan and his work to connect the United States and Turkey, but I'll also be talking about the identities that he created to do so and how the multifaceted nature of these identities have implications for the archive today and for our ability to recover his story and remember him as an Armenian American. So we're going to take a particularly close look at photographs that he produced in 1863 in the middle of the American Civil War to accompany his lectures on what he called the women of Turkey and how these images have found their way to us today, often via eBay. But first, to do this properly, we need a little bit of context. So I'm going to start at the very beginning and talk about Oscanyan himself. Let me share my screen. 1 second. Share and slideshow so you can see. This was the cover slide that no one saw. This is Christopher Oscanyan. Let me close this. Okay. So you can see him here on the left in the middle of a group of New Yorkers and visiting Turkish naval officers, and actually on the immediate left, Christopher Oscanyan, it's the mayor, the current mayor of New York in 1858. And then you can see him on the right in a self-curated image from 1863, which we'll talk more about later. So Christopher Oscanyan was born in 1818 in Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and now Istanbul, Turkey, which you can see at the arrow right there. As most of you very well know, Oscanyan was an Armenian Christian in an empire ruled by Muslim Turks, but the empire still had a very large Christian population at the time of his birth. It was an empire known for its multi-ethnic, multi-religious population. Armenians and Turks, as well as Arabs, Greeks, Circassian, and Jews, and many other ethno-religious communities lived side by side across the empire. Because U.S. audiences called the Ottoman Empire Turkey, and the Ottoman people Turks. I'm going to use the same words interchangeably today, and we're going to talk a lot more about why I'm doing this later in the talk. Now, with the help of American missionaries, Oscanyan came to the US for the first time in 1834 to study at what's now NYU. You can see here how he wrote his name in the registrar in Armenian letters. It also says that he's from Constantinople. Now, he knew English at this point, and so it was definitely a choice for him to represent himself in Armenian letters like this. He returned to the Ottoman capital between 1840 and 1854, only to then come back to New York for the remainder of his life. For most of his career, until some big changes in the 1870s, which we won't really would be able to talk about today, Oscanyan used a wide variety of pursuits and popular American media to try to, quote, correct erroneous impressions of the Turks or negative stereotypes. You know, these erroneous impressions are that Turks were uncivilized, barbaric, lazy, decadent, violent, and lustful. These kinds of representations are usually today called Orientalist stereotypes. Through his efforts, he sought to cultivate what he called mutual diplomatic relations between his two countries and to create a, quote, friendly relationship between the United States and the Ottoman Empire based on mutual understanding. So we're now going to take a brief overview of some of this work and how he presented as identity through it. One of the most successful ways that Oscanyan attracted an audience in the 19th century was through giving public lectures like this, I suppose, a popular form of entertainment in 19th century America. Starting in 1835, a year after he arrived in New York, Oscanyan gave his first public lectures on the topics of education among the Armenians, basically. In these lectures, Oscanyan leveraged the ancient past of the Armenians to connect with his American Christian audience and inspire charitable giving for American missionary schools in Turkey. Oscanyan's acts of affiliation in these lectures were quite clear. He spoke directly of Armenia as his, quote, nation and his country. He identified as an Armenian Christian to solicit his American Christian audience. And he demonstrated his, quote, civilization, say by quoting Shakespeare, in order to say basically, we Armenians are like you Americans. In closing his lectures, he expressed this similarity in another way, exclaiming, how wonderful, how interesting that the youngest nation of the earth should become the instructor of the oldest. Like teacher, like student, he was effectively saying. Now, throughout his Armenia lectures, Oscanyan, I jumped ahead a little bit, Oscanyan lamented the loss of Armenia's, quote, independence and political glory at the hands of the, quote, despotic tyrants who ruled over his people. By this, he meant the Ottomans, though he didn't identify them by name. So it's very interesting that in 1838, Oscanyan begins to affiliate with his homeland in a new way. He started to give lectures on Constantinople and the, quote, domestic manners, customs, and costumes of the Turks. Now, given what we said previously, we might expect that these lectures were extremely anti-Ottoman, but they are instead sympathetic portraits of the people of Turkey designed to counter the negative stereotypes with which Americans would be most familiar. At the end of one lecture in the series, Oscanyan even identified himself as an Ottoman, describing his expectations as those of a typical Ottoman man. Now, even though Oscanyan was naturalized as an American sometime in the late 1830s and married an American woman named Maria Louisa Skinner in 1839, Oscanyan returned to Constantinople with his new wife in 1840 at the exact time as a series of reforms were taking effect in the Ottoman Empire. These reforms were designed, at least in theory, to establish more legal and social equality among the ethno-confessional communities of the empire. This was a pursuit in which Oscanyan was a big believer. Now, in Istanbul, over the course of the 1840s, Maria Louisa gave birth to all 4 Oscanyan children. And among other endeavors in the capital, Oscanyan started one of the first ever Ottoman newspapers for the local Armenian community. During the Crimean War in 1854, Oscanyan installed an Oriental and Turkish museum in London to equate a British audience with their new Ottoman ally. This image at the left is from the cover of the catalog, and the exhibits themselves were of wax figure displays like Madame Tussauds, basically. Now, Oscanyan featured Armenians prominently in this exhibit and wrote in the museum's catalog that the Armenians were, quote, the real life and soul of Turkey. and that without them, quote, the Osmanlis, the Ottomans, would not survive a single day. This is an argument he would repeat later in the US too. Now, we might think that for an American or European audience, Oscanyan would want to distance himself from the Muslim rulers to once again assert his civilization. And in many places, he did just that, citing, for example, their fanaticism or their barbarism. And at times, he combined both sentiments, making statements that were all at once expressions of Armenian superiority and influence, critiques of the ruling power, and affiliations with Turkey and the Ottomans. This pride and emphasis on influence shows us that criticism and collaboration were not mutually exclusive. Armenians like Oscanyan felt both special and subjugated. In an imperial system of governing, in which society was organized by a religious hierarchy, Armenians and other non-Muslim subjects could feel and wield political power in and through their personal influence on important decision makers or the influence exerted by their people. Narratives like Oscanyan's show us that in the absence of Ottoman non-Muslim political equality, loyalty and influence were highly valued. Oscanyan's statements also show that a people can feel subjugated by a ruling power but not adopt the views of their rulers. To say one is subjugated or subordinated is not to say by definition that one has neither confidence or power. Indeed, Oscanyan's evocations of Armenian superiority and influence convey precisely Armenian confidence and power. So soon after Oscanyan returned to the US in 1855, he resumed lecturing on the topic of Turkey and its people. His stated affiliations with Turkey were even stronger than they had been in the 1830s. He identified and/or was identified as the Turk and a Turkish lecturer. You can also see his fez in the image right on the right, which he continued to wear in New York City throughout at least the 1880s. Oscanyan's American Turkishness did not mean that being Armenian was unimportant to him or that he was trying to deny his background. Quite the contrary. As we have just seen, Oscanyan considered himself to be first and foremost an Armenian. Being a Turk in America did not unmake him an Armenian. Rather, it made it legible to the largest possible audience that he was of Turkey, a land with Turkish rulers, not a land inhabited by a single ethno-religious group. To him, Turkey was a Muslim Christian empire state. As he wrote in the Oriental and Turkish Museum catalog, the Armenian community was the very life and soul of Turkey. For Oscanyan then, being a Turk was an American expression of ownership and of belonging. It was his American way of saying that he was an Ottoman and that he very much belonged to and came from the land that Americans call Turkey. Now, in these 1850s lectures, as in the 1830s, Oscanyan tried to place Ottoman Turks on equal footing with Americans and Europeans by encouraging his audience to think like Turks and understand their way of seeing the world. He loved using cultural relativism to show that many American practices would seem odd to an Ottoman. After his return in the 1850s, Oscanyan made 2 attempts to cultivate Turkish habits and habits of mind in an American public. In 1855, he established a Turkish coffee house at 625 Broadway. There's currently a Chipotle there. That's me in like 2015. His goal was to, quote, cultivate friendly relations between Turks and Americans by having them meet, quote, in an unrestrained and social way. He wanted Americans to socialize with Turks, to get to know them on their own terms, even though there were barely any Turks in the city to patronize such an establishment or with whom Americans could engage. Unfortunately, the coffee house failed after a year. He also tried on 2 separate occasions, in 1855 and 1862, to develop a Turkish bath in New York, but that effort likewise could not gather enough support. The image on the left of the Turkish baths is actually also from the Oriental and Turkish Museum catalog, and it was actually the very first exhibit, Exhibit A. Now, Oscanyan started writing for the city's newspapers in the 1850s, and in 1857, he published a book titled The Sultan and His People. In this book, Oscanyan positioned himself as an author particularly equipped to comment on the appropriate path to Ottoman reform and to construct a bridge between Muslims, Christians, and between the Ottoman Empire, Europe, and the United States. Underneath his author portrait, which you could see on the right-hand side, he featured two of his signatures, visually demonstrating his duality, and thus his role as an intermediary. The top in Armenian letters and the bottom in the Latin alphabet. On the title page, which you can see in the middle, he emphasized his native Ottoman and Armenian origins. So here's a close-up of the title page. He listed himself as C. Oscanyan of Constantinople, which he featured above an original crest that combined a range of Armenian symbols, including a lion, an eagle, an owl, Mount Ararat, and you can even see Noah's Ark, and the river Araxes, along with Oscanyan, again written in the Armenian letters. In the preliminary chapter of this book, he also underlined his insider status. The author presents himself to the American public, a native of Constantinople and of Armenian parentage. This way he can speak about these topics in a way no traveler could. The book's dedication, however, drew out his American bona fides. It read, "To my alma mater, the University of the City of New York, this work is respectfully dedicated by one of its offspring." In short, Oscanyan leveraged his affiliations to show that he could speak expertly about the Ottoman Empire and its people to an American Christian audience as an insider of all three communities. Now, this text itself was a mixed bag, which both used and subverted common tropes about Turkey. Read carefully, however, Oscanyan's book, like his lectures, sought to place Ottoman Turks on equal footing with Americans and Europeans. On the whole, he considered the Ottoman Empire capable of regeneration and reform, not a stagnant society incapable of, quote, civilization. In a 40-page section on the, quote, future of Turkey, he provided advice for how Turkey could best be, quote, preserved and resuscitated, positing ideas, pretty American ideas like church and state, decentralization, and the installation of European oversight. He believed especially that Christians and Muslims needed to have equal political and civil rights. Now, in the early 1860s, Oscanyan wrote anonymous editorials for the New York Herald on, quote, Eastern affairs. He wrote especially about how he thought the Eastern question should be solved, basically what to do about the weakening Ottoman Empire. In one of these columns, Oscanyan referred to the Armenians as the Yankees of the East, a nickname almost identical to the Yankees of the Orient, which the American press would call the Armenians during the massacres of the 1890s. As he had in his 1830 lectures, Oscanyan was here too, aiming to equate Armenians with Americans. He was drawing Armenian identity in American terms. So now, finally, to the images for which everything I've said to this point has been important context. In 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, Oscanyan began to adopt a more spectacular diplomacy. He started lecturing with a troupe of costumed models, all women and one Black man. By the end of the year, his lectures were advertised with the following exclamation: "The Grand Turk and his harem of Circassian slaves are coming." These lectures were wildly popular, and they were repeatedly touted by newspapers as being both instructive and entertaining. In September of 1863, Oscanyan published an album of 23 photos of himself and others wearing the Ottoman costumes from his popular Women of Turkey lectures. These images were also printed on carte de visite, which you can see on the left and the right, and it's often abbreviated as CDVs, which I'll say throughout the talk. These are basically small collectible cards, kind of like baseball cards. Here, he used himself to model Ottoman clothing and behavior, much like he'd wear his fez around town and championed Ottoman institutions like the Turkish coffee house and the Turkish bath. This also reinforced his image of being an expert representative of Turkey, which he also considered representative of him. Here is an image of Oscanyan CDVs from his collection that I've collected thus far. Here's like a 5-second video of Teddy enjoying them as well.
It's a baby.
So by 1861, the carte de visite this small photographic card, it measured about 2.5 inches by 4 inches, had become a popular object that one could send, possess, and collect. Americans and Western Europeans in particular would send copies of CDVs of themselves or of others to relatives and friends across countries and continents. They would also purchase collections of CDVs on themes such as scenery, art, or celebrity figures to place in albums dedicated to this purpose, often combining family photos with the images of famous people or places. So it's like, oh, here's Aunt Deb, here's my mom, and here's Abraham Lincoln type thing. This vogue for album assembly began in 1862, and Oscanyan, an early adopter as ever, took up and modified the form ASAP. And by September of 1863, ads appeared for Oscanyan's Oriental album, where he published 23 of these CDV photographs. And it appears that most of these models and the figures they represent were the same as would have appeared on stage on the platform during his lectures in New York and other places. And on the page of each, let's see. Oops, sorry, Teddy. Where's the page here? So like you see in this Circassian slave one, on the page opposite each image was a short descriptive text. And these photographs were intended to evoke the experience of attending one of his lectures. So in this way, the photographs were designed to be authentic representations of both the lectures as well as the Ottoman realities that they sought to represent. Now, Oscanyan's 1863 CDVs were not just American media, but American media produced during the American Civil War. At the very time that Oscanyan released his CDVs and Oriental albums, Orientalists, abolitionists were using the same mass market methods to distribute images of formerly enslaved people and the markers of their enslavement. So for example, the scars and brands on their bodies. Oscanyan's Oriental album was published within months of what is called the abolitionists' first major propaganda photograph, which you can see here, the scourged back of an escaped enslaved man called Gordon, who posed in a seated position with his severely scarred back turns towards the camera, and by extension, a northern white audience. You can see a print copy of this on the right-hand side, recently available on eBay. Oscanyan also published images of slavery, such as the Circassian slave on the left, and an image he called Slavery in Turkey, seen here on the right, which we must see as coexisting with the abolitionists' horrific photographs designed to demonstrate the cruelty of American chattel slavery and provoke an emotional and then a political response. They're out in the world at exactly the same time. Now, in distinction to that testimony, Oscanyan's images of enslaved people, lacking all signs of physical brutality, would have immediately conveyed to a northern white audience a slavery of a different character altogether, a slavery that might in some manner portray its Ottoman practitioners as comparatively civilized, compassionate, and logical. Now, inspired by Christopher Oscanyan, P.T. Barnum, the famous or infamous New York City showman, usually thought of now as the circus guy or of Barnum and Bailey, or from The Greatest Showman movie, marketed his own Circassian slave beauty beginning in 1864, a year after Oscanyan. You can see here that Barnum's image of himself is worth a lot on eBay even today. Now, Barnum displayed his Circassian beauty in his famous museum and dispersed her image on CDVs, as was the fashion. And in short order, these faux Circassian beauties popped up at dime museums and sideshows and were basically a mainstay of this kind of entertainment until the 20th century. Now, because all of these CDVs were mass-produced, many still find their way to us today, often in university or museum archives. You know, places have big collections of CDVs, but they also show up every day on places like eBay. And you can tell in part how popular certain images were by how easy they are to find now. So for example, when I search for CDVs from 1863, hoping against hope that I will find more Oscanyan CDVs, I am almost always able to find examples of what Barnum called General Tom Thumb's wedding. You can see the varied item names here, with the one on the right including popular search terms like circus, oddity, and midget. You can also pretty regularly find images of Barnum's Circassian beauty on eBay, which you can see there. You can see the search terms including circus, beauty, freak, sideshow. Oscanyan's images will occasionally pop up, but when they do, it's definitely a special occasion, not an everyday thing. Which brings us to the issue of searching and labeling and how these relate to the history of Christopher Oscanyan that we discussed together today. How things are labeled relates directly to how these objects are understood and perceived, and how easily they can be identified by researchers and descendants today who are looking for Armenian American history. So let's look at a few of the eBay posts for the Oscanyan CDVs. Here are two images that are pretty helpfully labeled. The one on the left clearly has been posted by someone who understands enough of the history of the object to refer to Oscanyan as Armenian, helping potential buyers and researchers identify the object. To the right, however, you can see a common issue beyond the typo, CDV Turkey, with no mention of Armenian or Armenian American. Likewise, you can see here a CDV labeled CDV Turkey Mr. Oscanyan and CDV Turkey Turkish. Neither of these images would come up if you use the search term Armenian or Armenian American, even though these are valuable pieces of Armenian American history. You might also not know what a CDV is, so you wouldn't even know necessarily to look for this kind of media. Conversely, if you are looking for Oscanyan specifically, you won't find him by searching his name, even though he is in the image labeled CDV Turkey Turkish. Now, similarly, with these beautiful images of Flower of Ararat Armenian Girl, you may be able to identify them as Armenian American history, but you don't know that they are produced by Christopher Oscanyan unless you already know. So in short, in order to locate, recover, and preserve the fullest, most meaningful Armenian American history, we must understand not only how to look for it, but how to see it on its own terms and not on the terms of today. So I'm going to end with a cabinet card on the left that I sadly missed out on eBay because I wasn't checking as regularly when it was listed. And I haven't seen this image anywhere else. And I don't know who bought it, and I therefore can't really use it properly like in any work in my book or anything, but it's fascinating. It's almost certainly from the 1880s based on the quality of the image, other comparative images, and it shows Oscanyan posting in a traditional Ottoman style, a sample of which you can see here also on eBay to the right. Now, Oscanyan's sympathy for Turkey was considerably weaker in the 1880s than it was before then. In fact, by the 1880s, he was actively rooting against them. So I am curious as to the context for him posing for this photo. So to that end, I'm just going to conclude our talk with noting that through eBay, we have a genuine archival mystery that I will be trying to solve in my work to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nora, for that fascinating talk. And it's now time for questions. I have a few, but
Okay.
I rather wait. If there are any questions before, let's see if there are any hands. If not, I'll start with mine, and then we'll wait for others to ask their questions. All right, so let me give you all some time to think about your questions. A couple of quick questions, Nora. One is, can you say something about this connection between the knowledge of people have about these labels and the CDVs, and the labels themselves, and then how those things impact the price in your experience of with Oscanyan?
Yes, so I can answer very concretely the last part of that, which is I noticed there was a flurry of these CDVs available, I believe around Easter. My dad, who's here, can confirm around when this was, and they were being released in phases. And I was tracking them, and I was certainly aware of what everything was. And so I was aware of the CDV Turkish ones, and those seem to fly a little bit more under the radar. But when the Armenian American ones were available, those got a higher price. My suspicion is because Armenian Americans were looking for Armenian American, memorabilia, historical items, these kinds of things. So I saw that directly. It seemed like more people understood what was there when it was labeled as Armenian.
So like you who's trying to acquire it, right?
Yeah.
You're almost benefiting from the
I totally, that one labeled CDV Turkish, that felt like a gift. I was like, no one's going to know what this is. I'm going to know what this is. And I'm not going to credit myself with this, but even as Oscanyan, I've produced more Googleable Oscanyan results as I've given talks or written papers, these kinds of things. I think the value of his stuff has gone up a bit, I've seen over time on eBay, just because when someone Googles to see, okay, who is this person? There are more hits, there are more recent hits, he seems like more of a figure. So in some ways, I'm watching this all happen certainly every day. The earlier parts of your question, like these issues of labeling the history, I think it certainly behooves a collector, someone who wants to collect. It behooves a historian, a librarian, or archivist to know as much history as possible so they can find as much material as possible. I know I'm preaching to the choir, especially to the librarians, the audience, who know very well that labeling is the name of the game and you can miss things because of how they're labeled. We also know that how things are transcribed or transliterated makes things harder or easier to find. So these are not new issues, but I think they're very nicely illuminated through this case study.
Wonderful, thank you. We do have a question in the chat, which is sort of connected to what we're talking about. How can we combat this misinformation online, and what is already being done in this regard by institutions, state, etc.? Yeah, I'm not sure how you would describe it. I'm not sure it's intentional, the information issue, but would you like to address this?
Sure. The misinformation is an interesting word here. I think it's incomplete information, maybe. I know, for example, that one of the people on eBay selling a bunch of Oscanyan CDVs did so on behalf of someone else. So this person was purely an intermediary. She had no knowledge of what these items even were until I reached out and said, you know what, can I just buy all of these? She says no, crazily, the person selling them wants to sell them individually, etc. And so I think it's even just a lack of knowledge on the part of people disseminating. And I think to that end, the way to combat that is by providing more and more information, complete information.
Level.
Yeah, I'm sorry. After all of these Zoom conferences I've been on, I still don't know where the automatic hand raise is. So I plead age. First, Nora, spectacular talk. Thank you very much. Secondly, Nina Garsoin always used to start our careers, or the careers of all her students, by saying, assume the ignorance of your readers or of your audience. And I have found that many of these misapplied, misinformed advertisements are ignorance, and not purposeful. And indeed, with my big mouth, I have actually dropped notes to people whose products I did not intend to buy, and I have said, by the way, do you know this is Armenian? And they receive it. Khachik, I think, knows the same thing. Third, I'm delighted that you are collecting these.
Yeah.
Okay, close your ears, Khachik. But my entire being as a librarian and a scholar is to get all of these into long-lasting institutions for everyone to use. I don't mean Armenian institutions in the West. I mean public institutions where they are guaranteed to exist for the benefit of everyone. So you're too young to think about this, but I do hope your will leave it to the Library of Congress.
I'll make a note. Sorry, Teddy.
And thank you for your talk.
Thank you so much. But that's a good reminder, actually, and I will think deeply about that.
Other questions? All right, I have another one.
Okay.
You said something about the sympathy for Turkey
Mhm.
and essentially deteriorating
Yeah.
by the 1880s. Uh, I was also sort of struck by the fact that he seems to have this love and hate relationship with Turkey, right?
Mhm.
Uh, on the one hand, is he sort of using the fact that Turkey at this point perhaps is better known than Armenia and Armenians,
Mhm.
and sort of to introduce himself? So is that part of what's going on here? And the second part of the question is, uh, yeah, can you talk about the deterioration itself and how does that factor into his sort of self-presentation and portrayal towards the later part of the 19th century?
Totally. Thank you. These questions are of the essence, kind of what the book's going to be about. So that's great. Basically, in the 1870s, his position starts to radically change against Turkey. He starts, for example, rooting for Russia in the Russia-Turkish War, when previously he said Russia was the ultimate evil type thing. And he starts encouraging Armenian immigration to the United States, late 70s, 80s, 90s. And by the 1890s, when the first massacres happen and he's on his sickbed, he is pleading for Turkey's obliteration. So he really makes a 180. And so, I've thought a lot about his affiliations, his changing affiliations with Turkey over time. And I try to present myself from, I guess, starting with the end in mind, which is to say, I try so hard not to think that change over time means that he was ever being insincere, or at least I use that as a practice as I look on him. Right now, I'm really thinking deeply about why, for example, or like how meaningful, for example, it was that the missionaries, they come to Constantinople in the early 1830s. He develops a relationship with them early on. They say to him, look, you are meaningful to us as an Armenian. So then when he goes to the United States, he understands himself to be meaningful as an Armenian. My suspicion, though I don't have a source that says this, is that he also starts being told in the United States that he's a Turk. And he starts to see, when he reads travelogues that are being published at this time, he starts to say, these are so wrong. And, the same way we might watch CNN nowadays and say, oh my God, you're so wrong. This is not right. He probably is like, let me say something. That could be a part of it. He could have also seen an opportunity to make some money. He also clearly has showman, or, he wants an audience tendencies, whatever you want to call that. But when he comes, particularly in the 1830s, having a missionary audience, being an Armenian, is meaningful. And so I'm not entirely sure if, no, Turk would definitely give him a bigger audience, but I do have outstanding questions about the size of the audience for him as an Armenian, because there was certainly, through a missionary lens, an understanding of what an Armenian was. I think that his belief in like Ottoman reform was genuine. The fact that he marries an American and then goes back to the Ottoman Empire for 14 years, and I think probably only left because of the war, or for all we know, like his wife wanted to go home. These are one of these historical things that we don't know. But I think he really wanted the Ottoman Empire to be better and do better, and he saw no reason why that wouldn't be the case. And until such time as he starts seeing, oh my gosh, that's not going to happen, he wants to do things to encourage that outcome.
Thank you. That's fascinating. All right. I'll spare you my next question because there's a bunch of questions here that
Okay.
we can try to address. Why don't I read a few of them, and then you can address them. So, do you collect only CDVs, or postcards are also part of your collection? One. And then, what happened when Barnum wanted to hire Oscanyan? Okay, let's address these two by Igor Grigoryan and Louise Lessersohn, and then
Okay.
we move on.
Sounds good. So Yes, I'm collecting really only the Oscanyan CDVs, though I recently bought quite inexpensively a Barnum one of an image of the General Tom Thumb, actually, that I showed, but like a different image, and where there's a Black servant. And I'm very interested in the kind of depictions, these popular depictions of a Black servant around the Civil War era, in essentially entertainment, because I think this is an important forum that I'm thinking about in my book, about how this is representing new forms of racial relations as, you know, the enslaved people have been freed and these kinds of things. There are no Oscanyan postcards that I know of, but, you know, for example, I have a collection courtesy of my father over many holidays of like old Harvard postcards. And so I have a few different collections ongoing, but I'm always and increasingly looking at eBay to see what's available, because it's one of my ways of learning in a way that I don't entirely know other ways to do outside of going to archives and browsing. It's a way of browsing and learning about the material culture of a previous time. To answer about what happened when Barnum wanted to hire Oscanyan. So basically Barnum tries to, when he sees Oscanyan's Circassian slave lectures, Women of Turkey lectures, he wants to hire Oscanyan to give lectures on his behalf, and Oscanyan turns him down. And I dwell on this in my work because to me it shows that Oscanyan did not want to be so directly affiliated with Barnum, who was known at the time and even now for inauthenticity, for turning his figures into more freak-like figures. And this is one of the ways I think about Oscanyan's more sincere educational goals. So even as he's using these methods to draw an audience and be popular, he doesn't want the authenticity, which is a whole topic we can have a separate conversation about, of his figures to be doubted or drawn into question. So Barnum makes it his own and actually becomes more popular with these images that, if anyone looked quite closely, are clearly not depicting an authentic Circassian woman, but they have an afro. They're meant to be this kind of liminal figure that tickles the American audience.
Great. We have a barrage of wonderful questions.
Okay.
So let's move to the next one. So Josh Chorbajan is asking, in your research, are you coming across other similar situations, cases? Perhaps you can address that. And then maybe let's also take Jennifer Manoukian's with this round. Thanks for your talk, Nora. I'm curious about Armenian-themed lecture series. Was he raising awareness, quote unquote, about Armenians among Americans who didn't know about them already, or tapping into an interest that already existed? The second, what did they know about Armenians already?
Great. So to answer Joyce's question first, similar situations insofar as sort of the Armenian Turk blend, yes, that comes up repeatedly. You know, Oscanyan's museum in London in the Crimean War was co-produced with another Ottoman Armenian. They are both referred to as Turks. When he gets to New York, there is another Armenian there with whom he starts the coffee shop endeavor, and then eventually, for some reason, they go separate ways. And that person, according to newspapers, which, you know, have all sorts of levels of credibility at this time, but was going to be responsible for the Turkish section of the New York version of the Crystal Palace, though recent research that I've done has indicated there actually wasn't a Turkish section of that exhibit. But anyway, the point being is that Armenians were often called Turks at this time, and it's later where that sort of becomes more of a Muslim term based on my research. You can read different things that say different things to that end. Speak to Jennifer's question. So what Oscanyan was doing in these 1830 lectures was raising awareness among Americans about the Armenian situation. And my sense is ideally to raise funds to help create schools in Turkey. In terms of what they previously knew, this is one of my outstanding questions and one I have to dig a bit deeper into in the coming months. But my sense is their knowledge is also coming from the missionaries. And so it's going to be the missionaries. It's also going to be religious knowledge. and where Armenia factors into, or Armenians factor into, their pre-existing Christian knowledge. And so this is a bit of an outstanding question, but a very important one.
Thank you. And sort of related to your first answer,
Mhm.
to the question, to earlier question is, do you have any idea, Levon is asking, what other Armenian Americans thought about Oscanyan?
Yeah. So for in the 30s, I don't know of really any others. By the 50s, there's a few others. One of the famous, or one of the early books on the Armenian American community, I think maybe says like 50 at this time, if that. So there aren't that many around until, say, the 70s, 80s, there are more. And by that point, he becomes known as the patriarch of the Armenian community in the United States. He is understood as being the first. He's understood as being a leader. But with that, he's understood as getting older. But that's kind of his positioning. So this 1894 article, which is essentially the last source I have, it's this letter he writes to the Armenian American community from his sickbed, lamenting the first massacres, saying Turkey needs to be obliterated by the Americans. That article refers to him as the patriarch of the Armenian community.
Yeah, that is a fascinating point, because I have also come across this with younger communities, right? You have, a person who is typically seen and sometimes even, known as the patriarch of the community. One such case that I can think of is actually Hong Kong right now, but maybe we can have this conversation.
Okay, yeah, I'll come down to the library.
Yeah, another question here is from Ani. She says, thank you, Nora, for sharing your knowledge with us. Did he ever travel, live in the Armenian provinces / Western Armenia?
Yeah, great question. I don't have any specific evidence that he traveled in like the Armenian provinces, Western Armenia. I have to assume I more than 50% assume that he did, just because I know he did a bunch of traveling in the 40s, for example, when he was in Constantinople, and I just have so little information about that period. I do know, actually, from the 1880s American census, that his parents were born in the Armenian provinces and migrated to Istanbul, Constantinople, where he was born. And I know this because in that census, you have to start listing the country of your birth and the country of your parents' birth. And for his, he puts Turkey, and for his parents, he puts Armenia, which is just like this beautiful American source that tells us this Armenian history. And that tells me that his parents made that move. So he has a relationship through his parents, about which we know very little else, though his father did end up having a big relationship with the American missionaries in Constantinople. He ended up selling Bibles for them, I believe, and he had a Protestant funeral in 1846, I believe, which was the source of some drama. People were throwing stones and such at the processional, but his father is a known entity in the American missionary community in Constantinople.
Great, thank you. So I was told that we typically end these talks, within an hour, and we still have a few more minutes. So maybe I can throw in one more question that I have, just fully taking advantage of my position as moderator here, and that has to do with his personal life. Like you talked a lot about the public person. How much do we know about his personal life, particularly his wife, his marriage, anything else that you may know about him that's not part of what he's presenting to an American audience or beyond, but is very much part of his reality, everyday life?
Yes, I mean, this is the question, the one I would spend so much time reading about if I could get really any good answers. I do not have letters or diaries of his. My research is very much based on fragments and his published materials, newspaper, these kinds of things. Bizarrely, even though his wife comes from a pretty prominent family, his father-in-law, for example, is one of the founders of the Union Theological Seminary, which is now a part of Columbia in New York City. I'm unable to find much writing from his wife. I've even talked to the person who researches the Skinner family, and she says this is a mystery that she also has. Like this is a woman for whom she doesn't have as much material as she has for other family members. So it's quite scarce, sadly. Little pieces of little evocations to me speak volumes that in this regard. So for example, Oscanyan in 1863 gives one of these Women of Turkey lectures on behalf of the New York Women's College of Medicine, on which his wife is on the founding board along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So I see that evocation of this like marital partnership as being very evocative. Also, for example, there is a time in, I believe, early 1866, maybe, where some of Oscanyan's friends are putting on a fundraising benefit concert, essentially, for Oscanyan because something has happened. I don't exactly know what happened, but there's this outpouring of sympathy for him, like he's fallen on some kind of hard times. One of his children, I believe, died young, probably in his early 20s. That's mentioned in a newspaper article where there's some lawsuit against one of these water cure places, and Oscanyan basically chimes in to say, oh, my son also, his cause of death was caused by this place. These kind of glimmers appear, but they're very, very scant. Another very humanizing source is when Oscanyan, there's a diarist, a famous diarist, who writes about running into Oscanyan when he's in want of something to do. And he says that he's not wearing his fez and he has, growth of like 3 days beard. And so he's conveying this very human distress and anxiety, and you're only seeing it in that glimmer from this diary. And these are my absolute favorite sources of mine, but they're few and far between. But I do feel like I have a sense of him as a person still from these kinds of glimmers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please stay tuned for future announcements from IAALA for future lectures, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you all so much for coming.